On the frozen banks of the canal, the city crowd froze, fingers pointed in shock at the small gray shape struggling in the churning black water. The stray dog had slipped from the treacherous ice, and now the merciless current was dragging him under. Panic and pure despair were etched on the animal's face as he paddled against the inevitable. Gasps of surprise turned to screams of horror as the dog's head bobbed under. But in that moment, a figure broke through the line of spectators. A tall man in a heavy peacoat and worn green boots didn't hesitate. He didn't stop to remove his heavy clothes or check the danger. He simply launched himself into the freezing void. The current tried to take him too, weighing down his soaked wool coat, but he moved with powerful, desperate energy, fighting the river like a soldier fighting a war. With one final, lunging stroke, his hand, scarred and shaking, grabbed the dog just before he disappeared into the dark forever. It was a moment that stopped time. But to understand why a broken man would risk everything for a stray dog he barely knew, you have to go back to where it all began. Buster was a dog living in a world of gray concrete and cold shadows. To the humans rushing past, he was just a dirty stray with a matted coat, invisible against the winter slush. But Buster saw the city differently. To him, the streets were a map of dangers and safe zones. He knew exactly which restaurant owners threw hot water and which alleys offered shelter from the wind. He moved with the caution of a soldier behind enemy lines, trusting no one, because in this concrete forest, trust was a mistake that could cost a dog his life. Hunger was his constant companion. It was a sharp, gnawing feeling in his belly that woke him up before dawn and kept him awake at night. To survive, Buster had to be smart. He learned that the large metal bins behind the bakery smelled sweet, like yeast and sugar, but they were guarded by a heavy metal door he couldn't open. The bins behind the butcher shop smelled of iron and blood, but a large, angry cat with razor-sharp claws claimed that territory. So, Buster survived on scraps, half-eaten burgers dropped by teenagers, or crusts of pizza left on park benches. He categorized the humans into species. There were the rushers, who marched with their heads down, staring at glowing rectangles in their hands. They never saw him. Then there were the loud ones, usually small humans, who screamed and chased, forcing Buster to vanish under parked cars. Worst of all were the night walkers. These humans smelled sharp and sour, and they swung their legs unpredictably. Buster learned early on that if a night walker saw him, a bottle or a stone would soon follow. His day was a series of tactical movements. In the morning, he patrolled the market for fallen fruit. At midday, he slept under the loading dock of a warehouse, where the warm air from a dryer vent blew out onto the street. It was his only luxury. He would close his eyes and imagine a time before the streets, a time of soft blankets and warm hands, though the memory was fading like an old scent in the rain. As the sun began to set, turning the gray sky into a bruised purple, the temperature dropped. The puddles on the sidewalk began to harden into ice. This was the hardest time. The city lights flickered on, buzzing with electricity, and the noise of the traffic grew louder as the humans rushed to their warm dens. Buster felt the isolation acutely. Every window that lit up was a reminder of a world he wasn't allowed to enter. He made his way toward the canal. The water there was black and oily, but it was quiet. The wind coming off the river was biting, cutting through his thin fur. But fewer humans walked there. It was a place for discarded things, and Buster felt he belonged there. He trotted along the frozen mud of the bank, his ears swiveling, listening for the crunch of boots on snow. That was when he saw the figure. It was a human, but he wasn't moving. He wasn't rushing, or shouting, or staggering. He was just standing there, statuesque against the railing. Most humans ignored the river, but this man was staring right into the black current. Buster paused, lifting his nose to test the air. The wind shifted, carrying the man's scent toward him. It was a complex smell. There was the metallic tang of old machinery, the earthy smell of strong tobacco, and something else. Something clean and sharp, like soap. But underneath it all was a heavy, damp scent that Buster recognized instantly. It was the scent of being alone. It smelled like wet wool and silence. Buster lowered his body, making himself smaller. Usually, seeing a human, this still made him nervous. Stillness often meant a trap, but this man's stillness felt different. It felt heavy. The man's shoulders were slumped forward, as if he were carrying a heavy pack that no one else could see. He didn't look dangerous. He looked defeated. The man sighed, and a cloud of white steam escaped his lips, drifting away into the night. He took a hand out of his pocket, not to throw a stone, but to rub his face wearily. The gesture was so tired, so human, that Buster felt a strange tug in his chest. It wasn't pity, exactly. It was recognition. This human was a stray, too. Buster took a step forward, his paws making a soft sound on the frozen earth. His instincts shouted at him to turn back, to find a dry basement and hide. But the pull of that shared sadness was stronger than his fear. He wanted to see if the man would shout. He wanted to know if he was truly invisible to everyone, or just to the ones who didn't care. Then he found the soldier. That was what Buster called the man standing by the frozen canal. He was tall and stood with a perfectly straight back, staring at the black water as if guarding it from an invisible enemy. He wore worn-out green boots and didn't smell like fear or cruelty. He smelled of old metal, strong tobacco, and a deep, heavy sadness. Buster stopped 10 paces away. For the first time, his instincts didn't scream, "Run." They whispered, "Wait." They met at the same spot every evening at 18, thoughted sharp. The soldier was always on time. He didn't try to pet Buster or talk in that silly, high-pitched voice other humans used. He simply acknowledged the dog with a short nod, like one sentry greeting another. They stood together in the falling snow, two scarred survivors watching the dark river flow. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was respectful. It was the quiet understanding of two creatures who had seen too much. The routine became the anchor on Buster's chaotic life. No matter how hungry he was or how cold the day had been, he made sure to be at the riverbank before the church bell rang 6 times. He would check the area first, sniffing for other dogs or dangerous humans, securing the perimeter. When the soldier arrived, walking with his rhythmic, heavy gait, thud, scuff, thud, Buster would emerge from the shadows, tail low but wagging ever so slightly at the tip. For the first few nights, the soldier barely moved. He would lean his elbows on the freezing metal railing and smoke a cigarette. Buster watched the glowing orange ember, fascinated. The smoke would swirl around the man's head like a gray halo. Buster sat near the trash can, keeping a safe distance of exactly 3 meters. It was close enough to feel like company, but far enough to bolt if the soldier turned aggressive. Buster began to study the man. He noticed the way the soldier's left hand trembled sometimes, and how he would clench it into a fist until the shaking stopped. He noticed a long, pale scar running down the side of the man's neck, disappearing into his collar. Buster had scars too, one on his ear from a fight with a terrier, and a patch on his flank where fur wouldn't grow. These marks were badges of survival. They made the soldier seem less like a giant and more like a pack member. Sometimes the soldier would talk, but not to Buster. He would mutter to the water. The words were low and mumbled, fragments of memories that Buster couldn't understand. Should have checked, or too quiet. The tone was always laced with regret. Buster would prick his ears forward, tilting his head. He didn't know the words, but he knew the tone. It was the sound a dog makes when it is left behind. The weather grew worse as the week went on. The wind off the water turned vicious, carrying ice pellets that stung the skin. On the 5th night, Buster was shivering violently, his teeth chattering despite his best efforts to stay still. The soldier noticed. He turned his head and looked at Buster. For a moment, the man looked like he might unzip his heavy coat. He took a half step toward the dog. Buster flinched and stepped back. The soldier froze, nodded understandingly, and stepped back to the railing. He respected the boundary. By the 6th night, Buster found himself waiting for the soldier with an eagerness that frightened him. When the green boots appeared on the path, Buster let out a small, involuntary whine. The soldier looked at him, and the corners of his eyes crinkled. It wasn't a smile, not really, but the hardness in his face softened. "Cold one tonight," the soldier said. His voice was rough, like gravel, but warm. Buster moved a little closer that night. He sat 2 meters away instead of 3. He could smell the coffee on the man's breath. He sat with his back to the wind, using the soldier's legs as a shield against the gale. The man didn't move away. He stood like a wall, blocking the worst of the weather for the small, shivering dog. It was the first act of protection Buster had accepted in years. On the 7th night, the air was heavy with the promise of snow. Buster's stomach was twisting with hunger. He hadn't eaten in 2 days, the trash cans having been emptied early by the sanitation trucks. He felt lightheaded and weak. When the soldier arrived, Buster didn't stand up to greet him. He just lifted his head, too tired to wag his tail. The soldier watched him for a long time. He seemed to be debating something internal. Slowly, deliberately, he reached into the deep pocket of his coat. Buster tensed. Was it a rock? A weapon? But then came the sound, the crinkle of wax paper, and then came the smell. Roasted turkey. The scent hit Buster like a physical blow, making his mouth water instantly. The soldier unwrapped a thick sandwich. He broke it in half. He didn't toss it carelessly into the dirt. He crouched down, his knees popping with the effort, and placed the food gently on top of the snow, midway between them. He didn't pull his hand away immediately. He let it hover there for a second, palm open, showing he held nothing else. Buster stared at the meat. Then he stared at the man. His survival instincts screamed that this was a trap. "Bait," the voice in his head warned. "He wants to grab you." But then he looked at the soldier's eyes. They were gray and tired, mirroring the winter sky. But they held no malice. They held a quiet invitation. On the 7th night, the soldier reached into his pocket. He didn't throw the food like it was trash. He crouched down slowly, his knees cracking, and placed half a sandwich on a clean patch of snow. He looked Buster in the eye, not a stare of dominance, but an invitation. Buster approached slowly, his muscles tense. He ate the food in one gulp. When he looked up, the soldier was still watching him. "At ease, soldier," the man whispered. It was the first time Buster heard his voice. The weather turned violent on Tuesday. The sky grew dark as bruises, and the wind began to howl like a wounded animal. A polar front hit the city, burying the streets in ice and snow. Buster's usual shelter, a cardboard fortress behind a warehouse, collapsed under the weight of a snowdrift. The cold was a physical blow. It bit through his fur and gnawed at his bones. Buster knew that if he stopped moving tonight, the frost would take him forever. The city transformed into a hostile, alien landscape. The familiar smells of garbage and exhaust were frozen over, replaced by the sterile, metallic scent of snow. Cars crawled along the streets like blinded beetles, their lights cutting through the white haze. Buster tried to find cover in a bus stop, but a group of humans, stomping their feet and shouting to be heard over the wind, kicked at him until he fled back into the storm. He trotted with his head down, squinting against the stinging ice pellets. His paws were numb blocks of ice. He could barely feel the ground beneath them. Every few steps, he had to stop and lift a leg, shivering violently as the cold seeped up through his pads. The warm vent behind the warehouse was buried deep under a drift, its life-saving heat lost to the storm. Hunger was no longer the enemy. The cold was the predator now. It whispered to him, urging him to just lie down in a soft pile of snow and close his eyes. It promised that the shivering would stop, that sleep would be warm and easy. Buster shook his head, shaking the snow from his ears. He knew that lie. He had seen other dogs listen to it and never wake up. He needed a plan. He needed an ally. In the swirling chaos of his mind, one image remained steady: the soldier. The man with the green boots and the coat that smelled of tobacco. The man who had shared his food. The soldier was strong. He stood like a rock against the wind. If there was any safety in this frozen hell, it was near him. Buster changed direction, turning his nose toward the river. The wind was stronger there, unobstructed by buildings, whipping down the channel like a tunnel. It pushed against him, trying to slide him backward on the slick pavement. He dug his claws in, leaning his small body into the gale. He was a soldier too, he told himself. He was on a mission. The journey to the riverbank felt endless. Landmarks he knew. The bakery, the red fire hydrant, were ghosts in the whiteout. He navigated by instinct and memory. He passed the alley with the mean cat, who was surely indoors tonight, and crossed the wide avenue where the traffic lights swung dangerously on their cables. Finally, he smelled the water damp and freezing. He was close. His heart hammered against his ribs, partly from exertion, partly from hope. He pictured the soldier standing there at the railing, a solid dark shape in the whiteness. He imagined pressing against the man's leg, sharing the small pocket of shelter behind his coat. He scrambled down the snowy embankment, his paws slipping. "I'm here," he wanted to bark, but the wind stole his breath. He reached the paved path along the canal. He saw the familiar metal bench, now capped with a thick layer of snow. He saw the trash can where they usually met. He stopped. He blinked, trying to clear the ice from his eyelashes. The railing was empty. The bench was empty. The path was unbroken by footprints. The snow was smooth and perfect, erasing any sign that a human had been there. Buster ran in a tight circle, sniffing frantically at the ground, sneezing as he inhaled snow. He barked once, a sharp sound that was swallowed instantly by the roar of the storm. He waited. Maybe the soldier was late? Maybe the wind had hidden his scent? But the soldier was never late. 18 thoughted sharp. Driven by a desperate need for warmth, Buster pushed through the blizzard toward the canal. He needed to find his ally. The soldier was the only living thing in this city who had shown him kindness. Buster fought against the wind, his paws numb, his eyes stinging. But when he reached the familiar bench, it was empty. The soldier wasn't at his post. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced Buster's chest. He was alone in the white void. Through the swirling white curtain of snow, Buster spotted a dark figure on the opposite bank of the canal. It was the soldier, walking with his head down, fighting the gale. Buster barked, but the wind tore the sound away. He couldn't lose him. He wouldn't. Seeing the canal frozen over, Buster made a decision. He stepped onto the ice to cross the river. He didn't know the current underneath was warm from the city drains. The ice groaned, cracked, and suddenly gave way. The world turned upside down. One moment he was running, his claws clicking on the white surface. The next, the floor vanished. He plunged into a darkness that burned. The water was a shock so profound it stole the air from his lungs. It was black, oily, and colder than death. It clamped around his chest like an iron vice, squeezing the heat out of his small body in a heartbeat. Buster thrashed, his paws paddling frantically against nothing. He broke the surface, gasping for air, but swallowed a mouthful of freezing, foul-tasting water. He tried to bark, but only a choked gurgle came out. The edges of the broken ice were jagged and slippery. He hooked his front paws over the rim, trying to pull himself up, but his back legs were heavy, dragging him down. The current tugged at him, pulling him toward the center of the channel. He scrambled, his nails scraping uselessly against the glass-hard surface. He was slipping. The cold was numbing his muscles, turning his blood to slush. His vision began to tunnel, the white snow above fading into gray. He was going to drown. He was going to die alone in the dark. Then he heard it. A shout. Not a casual human shout, but a roar of command. Through the blur of water and snow, he saw a shadow moving fast. It wasn't walking away anymore. It was running toward him. The soldier. He was running along the opposite bank, sliding down the snowy slope without hesitation. Buster whined, a high, thin sound of terror. He was slipping under again. The black water closed over his nose. He kicked wildly, his strength fading. "Hold on," his instincts screamed. "Pack is coming." He saw the soldier reach the edge of the ice. A normal human would have stopped. A sensible human would have called for help. But the soldier didn't stop. He threw himself flat onto the frozen surface, spreading his weight. He crawled, using his elbows like picks, dragging his body toward the hole in the ice. The ice groaned under the man's weight. Spiderwebs of cracks shot out from beneath his chest. He didn't care. He reached the edge of the dark water. Buster saw the man's face, pale, eyes wide and fierce, teeth bared in a grimace of effort. The soldier reached out a hand. It seemed miles away. Buster lunged one last time, summoning every drop of energy left in his freezing body. He stretched his neck, paddling with frantic desperation. The soldier lunged too, risking everything as the ice dipped dangerously beneath him. Fingers brushed fur. Then, a grip. The water was a shock of liquid fire, freezing his muscles instantly. Buster struggled, gasping, his head slipping under. Then, strong hands grabbed his scruff. The soldier had crawled onto the ice, ignoring the danger. With a grunt of military effort, he hauled Buster up, soaking his own sleeves in the freezing water. They scrambled onto the muddy bank, both shivering violently. The soldier didn't check himself. He checked the dog. "I've got you, buddy," he chattered through clenched teeth. "Leave no one behind." The soldier's apartment was like a barracks, clean, empty, and perfectly ordered. There were no photos on the walls, just a clock ticking loudly in the silence. But to Buster, it was a palace. The air was warm and still. The soldier dried Buster with a rough towel, his hands shaking from the cold, but his touch was gentle. He laid a thick wool blanket on the floor by the heater. "This is your station now," the man murmured. Buster stood on the blanket, dripping and shivering, looking around this strange new world. The floor was hard wood, smelling of polish. A small kitchen area stood in the corner, spotless and bare, with only a single mug drying on the rack. There were no piles of laundry, no scattered shoes, no signs of the chaos that usually marked human dens. It was a space designed for survival, not comfort. Just like the streets, the soldier moved with stiff, jerky motions. He peeled off his own soaked jacket and hung it over a chair, water dripping onto the floor. He didn't seem to notice the puddle forming. He went into the bathroom and returned with a bowl of water, placing it next to the blanket. Buster drank greedily, the room temperature liquid soothing his raw throat. Then came the food. The soldier opened a can of something that smelled like beef and gravy. He didn't have a dog bowl, so he tipped the contents onto a small ceramic plate. Buster ate with frantic speed, his tail tucked between his legs, expecting someone to shout or kick him away. But the soldier just sat on the edge of his narrow bed, watching. After eating, Buster began to explore the perimeter, his claws clicking softly on the floor. He sniffed the legs of the simple table. He sniffed the heavy boots by the door. Every corner of the room smelled of the soldier tobacco, Old Spice, and that underlying scent of solitude. There were no other scents here. No women, no children, no other animals. This man was a lone wolf. The warmth of the heater began to seep into Buster's bones. His shivering slowed to a tremble, then stopped. He felt a heavy, unfamiliar sensation dragging at his eyelids. Safety. It was a drug he hadn't tasted in years. His muscles, usually coiled tight for flight or fight, began to unspool. The soldier finally stood up. He walked to the window and pulled the heavy curtain shut, blocking out the storm and the city lights. He double-checked the deadbolt on the front door, rattling the handle to be sure. Then he checked the window latch. Buster watched this ritual with understanding. Secure the den. Check the exits. They spoke the same language. The man turned off the main light, leaving only the amber glow of a street lamp filtering through a crack in the curtains. He coughed, a wet, hacking sound that made Buster's ears perk up, and rubbed his chest. He looked smaller now, without his heavy coat, his shoulders thin under a gray t-shirt. Buster returned to the wool blanket. It was scratchy, but it was the softest thing he had ever touched. He circled 3 times, kneading the fabric with his paws, making a nest. He lay down, resting his chin on his front paws, his eyes fixed on the man. Buster ate a bowl of warm stew, his belly full for the first time in years. He watched the soldier pace the room, checking the locks on the windows and the door, a habit he couldn't break. Finally, the man collapsed onto the narrow bed. Buster hesitated, then walked over and curled up on the rug beside the bed. He let out a long sigh. The soldier dropped a hand over the side of the mattress, resting it lightly on Buster's fur. The patrol was over. They were safe. The next morning, the bugle didn't sound. The soldier didn't wake up at dawn as he usually did. The apartment was silent, but the air smelled wrong. It smelled of sickness and sweat. Buster nudged the man's hand, but it was limp and burning hot. The plunge into the icy river had taken its toll. The soldier was tossing and turning, muttering commands in his sleep, fighting a war that was only in his dreams. Buster sat by the bed, whining softly. Usually, morning meant the sounds of the city waking up, of boots on the floor, of the coffee machine gurgling. But today, the only sound was the soldier's ragged breathing. It sounded like air being pulled through a wet sponge. Rattle. Wheeze. Rattle. Buster stood on his hind legs, placing his front paws on the mattress. He licked the man's cheek. The skin tasted of salt and fire. The soldier flinched but didn't wake. His face was pale, glistening with sweat, and his dark hair was plastered to his forehead. He mumbled something unintelligible. "Incoming." "Get down!" and thrashed his legs under the tangled sheets. The dog dropped back to the floor and paced. He went to the door and scratched it once, then looked back. No reaction. He went to the empty water bowl and nudged it with his nose, creating a metallic scrape against the floor. Still nothing. The silence of the apartment, once peaceful, now felt heavy and suffocating. Buster realized with a jolt of fear that the pack leader was down. The strong hand that had pulled him from the ice was now weak. The vigilant eyes were closed. In the wild, a sick leader was a danger to the whole pack. It attracted predators. But here, inside the fortress, the danger was the sickness itself. He needed to help. He trotted to the pile of clothes the soldier had discarded the night before. He found a thick gray sock. It was Buster's only possession now, a toy he had claimed. He picked it up gently in his teeth and carried it to the bed. He dropped it on the soldier's chest. "Here, a gift. Wake up." The soldier groaned. His hand moved blindly, fingers curling around the sock. He squeezed it tight, as if holding on to a lifeline, but his eyes remained shut. "Cold," he whispered, his voice a cracked ruin. "So cold." Buster didn't understand the words, but he understood the tone. Need warmth. The man was burning up, yet shivering as if he were back on the ice. Buster looked at the wool blanket on the floor, then at the bed. He made a decision. He jumped onto the mattress. He knew this was forbidden territory. Most humans shouted if a muddy dog touched their sleeping place, but this was an emergency. Buster crawled carefully over the sheets, avoiding the man's flailing limbs. He pressed his furry body against the soldier's side, stretching out from hip to shoulder. He laid his head on the man's chest, right over his heart. He could hear it hammering. Thump, 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 too fast, like a trapped bird. Buster stayed perfectly still, offering his own steady warmth, his own slow heartbeat as an anchor. He closed his eyes, focusing all his energy on the man. "I am here. I am the guard." Slowly, the soldier's thrashing stopped. His hand drifted down and buried itself in the fur of Buster's neck. His breathing didn't clear, but the rhythm slowed, syncing with the dog's. They lay there together in the dim light, two casualties of the storm, holding onto each other in the quiet war against the fever. Buster knew something was terribly wrong. His new pack leader was down. The dog didn't leave the bedside. He brought his only toy, an old sock, and placed it on the soldier's chest, offering comfort. He licked the man's burning face, trying to cool the fever. But the soldier didn't open his eyes. He just groaned, lost in the dark fog of illness. Buster realized that for the first time, he was the one who had to stand guard. Night fell, and the shadows in the apartment grew long and menacing. The soldier's breathing became ragged and shallow, a terrifying rattle in his chest. Buster paced from the bed to the door and back again. His instincts were screaming. In the wild, a sick animal hidden in a den usually didn't come out, but this was his soldier. Buster knew he had to break the rules of silence. The apartment was pitch black now. The street lamp outside flickered, casting erratic bursts of orange light across the floor. In those flashes, Buster saw the soldier's face. It was gray, the color of old ash. His lips were dry and cracked, slightly parted as he gasped for air. He hadn't moved for hours, not even to cough. The heat radiating from his body was intense, filling the small room with the smell of danger. Buster was thirsty. His tongue felt like sandpaper, and his throat was dry. But he couldn't think about water. Every fiber of his being was focused on the man. He nudged the soldier's hand again, harder this time. using his cold, wet nose to push against the palm. The hand flopped lifelessly back onto the mattress. Fear, cold and sharp, twisted in Buster's gut. This was the same feeling he had on the ice, the feeling of slipping away. "He is leaving," the instinct whispered. "The pack is breaking." Buster whimpered, a high-pitched sound that seemed too loud in the silent room. He jumped off the bed and ran to the front door. He sniffed the crack at the bottom. He could smell other humans in the hallway. Cooking smells, laundry detergent, old shoes. Life was happening just on the other side of that wood. Why couldn't they hear the silence in here? Why didn't they know the soldier was fading? Buster scratched the door. Scritch, scritch, scritch. He paused, ears swiveled back. Nothing. Just the hum of the refrigerator and the terrible, wet rattle of the soldier's breath. He scratched harder, digging his claws into the paint, splinters flying. Still nothing. He ran back to the bedroom. He put his front paws on the soldier's chest and licked his face frantically. "Wake up!" his body language screamed. "You have to wake up!" The soldier's head rolled to the side, eyes still closed, a low moan escaping his lips. It was a sound of surrender. Buster backed away. The gray rules of the street, be quiet, be invisible, survive, clashed with a new, burning loyalty. Silence was safety, but silence was death right now. He looked at the door. He looked at the man. The choice was made. He planted his feet firmly on the floor. He drew in a deep breath, expanding his ribs until they hurt. He let it out. Woof. The sound was small at first, rusty from disuse. He tried again. Woof. Louder, sharper. He ran to the door and barked at the wood, the sound bouncing off the walls. "Bark! Bark! Bark!" He put all his fear, all his hunger, and all his love into the noise. He wasn't a stray anymore. He was a sentry, sounding the alarm. He listened. Was that a footstep in the hall? He didn't wait. He threw his head back, closing his eyes, and channeled the ancient song of his ancestors. A howl rose from his throat, long and mournful, vibrating through the floorboards. It was a cry that said, "I am here, and I am alone, and I need help." He ran to the front door and let out a sharp, demanding bark. Then another. He listened. Nothing. He ran back to the bed, nudged the unconscious man, and then ran back to the door. He threw his head back and howled, a deep, mournful sound that carried all the pain and fear of his life on the streets. It was an SOS signal. He barked until his throat was raw, calling for reinforcements. The reinforcements arrived with a crash. The front door splintered open and light flooded the hallway. Neighbors stood there, led by an old woman with a cane, looking terrified. They expected a monster, but they found a frantic dog spinning in circles, leading them to the bedroom. When they saw the soldier lying unconscious, the fear in their eyes turned to concern. "He's burning up," someone shouted. "Call the medics!" Buster retreated to the corner of the room, barking once more to make sure they understood. "Here! Look here!" The old woman, Mrs. Hand. Higgins hobbled into the room, her floral robe sweeping the floor. A younger man in a t-shirt followed her, holding a baseball bat that he quickly lowered when he saw the scene. "Oh my stars, Mrs. Praise," Higgins whispered, pressing a hand to her mouth. She moved toward the bed with surprising speed. She touched the soldier's forehead and pulled her hand back as if burned. "Arthur, Arthur, can you hear me?" The younger man was already on his phone, pacing the small room. "Yeah, 911? We need an ambulance." "Apartment 4B. Male, unconscious, high fever." respiratory distress. Yeah, hurry. He looked at Buster, who was trembling in the corner, and added softly, "And bring a blanket. It's freezing in here." Buster watched them invade his fortress. Strangers, loud voices, the smell of panic. His instincts told him to defend his territory, to drive them out. But he saw Mrs. Higgins placing a cold, wet cloth on the soldier's head. He saw the young man checking the soldier's pulse. They were helping. They were the reinforcements he had called. The sound of sirens grew louder outside, wailing closer and closer until they stopped right below the window. Heavy footsteps thundered up the stairs. The door was pushed wider, and two humans in uniforms burst in, carrying bags and a collapsible bed. The room became a whirlwind of activity. Beeping machines, snapping plastic, curt commands. "BP is dropping! Get the oxygen! Let's move him now!" They lifted the soldier. His limbs were heavy and loose. They strapped him onto the rolling bed. Buster couldn't stay in the corner anymore. He darted forward, whining, trying to lick the soldier's hand one last time. "Hey, watch the dog!" a medic shouted, waving a hand at him. Buster flinched but didn't back down. He needed to go with them. He was the guard. He couldn't abandon his post. They began to wheel the soldier out. Buster scrambled after the wheels, his claws clicking frantically on the floor. He tried to squeeze through the door alongside the stretcher, but the young neighbor blocked his path with a gentle leg. "No, buddy, you can't go," the man said, his voice apologetic. The door to the hallway was closing. Buster saw the elevator doors open. He saw the soldier disappear inside. The metal door slid shut, cutting off the view of the green boots. Gone. The apartment was suddenly empty, the silence returning with a vengeance. Buster scratched at the closed front door, letting out a sharp yip of distress. Then he felt a touch on his collar. He froze. He looked up. Mrs. Higgins was kneeling beside him, leaning heavily on her cane. Her eyes were wet. They took him away on a rolling bed with flashing lights. Buster tried to follow, slipping through the legs of the paramedics, but the door slammed shut in my face. Buster was left in the hallway, scratching at the wood. Then a soft hand touched his collar. It was the old woman, Mrs. Higgins. She didn't look angry anymore. She looked sad. "Come on, brave boy," she said, her voice shaking. "He needs you to wait for him." She clipped a leash onto my collar and led the dog gently away from the empty apartment. Buster was transferred to Mrs. Higgins' apartment. It was soft and smelled of lavender, a stark contrast to the soldier's Spartan quarters. She fed him well and brushed his coat until it shined, but Buster felt hollow. He spent his days lying by the front door, his chin on his paws, ears swiveled toward the hallway. He was waiting for the sound of heavy boots. He was waiting for his mission to resume. Life at Mrs. A.B. Higgins was comfortable, perhaps too comfortable. There was a fat orange cat named Marmalade who watched Buster from the top of a bookshelf with golden, judgmental eyes. They had established a truce on the first day. Buster wouldn't chase, and Marmalade wouldn't hiss. They simply ignored each other, two planets orbiting different suns. Mrs. Higgins talked constantly. The silence that Buster had shared with the soldier was replaced by a gentle, rolling stream of words. "Eat up, Buster. You need your strength," she would say as she filled his bowl with roasted chicken. Real chicken, not scraps. Or, "Look at the snow melting, spring is coming." Her voice was kind, like the cooing of a pigeon, but it wasn't the voice he wanted to hear. Every morning, Mrs. Higgins would sit in her armchair with her phone, scrolling slowly with a shaking finger. Sometimes she would smile. "The fever is down," she would tell Buster, looking over her reading glasses. "The doctors say his lungs are clearing." Buster would wag his tail once, a polite acknowledgement, but he didn't truly understand. He only knew that the soldier wasn't here. The apartment building, once a place of closed doors and suspicion, seemed to change. Neighbors stopped by Mrs. Higgins's door to drop off food or ask for updates. "How's the hero dog?" the young man from 4B would ask, scratching Buster behind the ears. "Any news on Arthur?" They looked at Buster with respect now. He wasn't just a stray. He was the dog who saved the quiet man in 4B. But pride couldn't fill the emptiness in the room. At night, Buster would pace. He missed the smell of tobacco and Old Spice. He missed the hard floor and the scratchy wool blanket. He missed the feeling of a heavy hand resting on his head in the dark. This soft apartment felt like a cage wrapped in velvet. He developed a routine. Whenever he heard the heavy clunk of the building's front door opening downstairs, he would run to Mrs. Higgins' door and press his nose against the crack. He would listen to the footsteps climbing the stairs or the hum of the elevator. He analyzed every sound. Click, clack, click, clack. Too fast. That was the lady from 3C. Thump, thump, thump. Too light. The kids from the second floor. Shuffle drag. Too slow. The janitor. None of them had the steady, rhythmic march of the soldier. None of them carried the scent of rain and metal. Each time the footsteps passed the door and faded away down the hall, Buster would let out a long, shuddering breath and return to his rug. 1 week passed. Then 2. The weather outside changed. The biting wind softened, and the gray slush on the sidewalks began to wash away in the rain. The world was waking up from winter, but Buster felt more tired than ever. The hope that had burned so brightly was beginning to dim, replaced by the old, cold reality of the streets. Humans left. That was what they did. On the 15th day, Buster didn't run to the door when the elevator chimed. He stayed on his rug, staring at the wall. Maybe the soldier wasn't coming back. Maybe the patrol was over for good, and Buster was just a dog without a mission again. He closed his eyes, trying to summon the memory of the soldier's face, but it felt distant, like a dream fading in the morning light. Days turned into weeks. The snow outside melted into spring slush. Every time the elevator chimed, Buster scrambled to his feet, tail ready to wag, only to let it drop when a stranger walked by. The hope began to fade, replaced by the old, familiar ache of abandonment. He wondered if the soldier had been just another fleeting shadow in the gray city. Buster closed his eyes and let out a heavy sigh, preparing to be a stray at heart once again. Then, on a Tuesday morning, the pattern broke. The elevator pinged, and the footsteps that followed were slow and uneven, but Buster knew them instantly. Thud. Scuff. Thud. It was the rhythm of the soldier. Buster began to whine, scratching frantically at the wood. Mrs. Higgins opened the door, and there he was, thinner, paler, leaning on a cane, but standing straight. When he saw the dog, the soldier dropped to his knees, opening his arms. Buster didn't just run, he launched himself. He hit the soldier's chest with a force that nearly knocked the man over. But the soldier just laughed, a raspy, beautiful sound. Buster licked his face, his hands, his neck, whimpering and yelping in a chaotic symphony of joy. The scent was right. It was him. Tobacco, antiseptic, and underneath it all, the deep, earthy smell of the pack leader. "Easy, buddy, easy," the soldier murmured, burying his face in Buster's fur. His hands were shaking again, but this time not from cold. "I'm back. I'm here." He held Buster tight, rocking slightly back and forth. For a long moment, neither of them moved, just breathing in the reality of the reunion. Mrs. Higgins stood in the doorway, wiping her eyes with a tissue. "He waited every minute," she said softly. "He never stopped guarding the door." The soldier looked up at her, his eyes red-rimmed but clear. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "for saving him." "He saved you first," she replied with a smile. They walked back to the soldier's apartment together. It was exactly as they had left it, but somehow different. The air wasn't stale anymore. Mrs. Higgins had opened a window. The silence wasn't heavy. It was peaceful. The soldier sat on the edge of the bed, exhausted but content, and Buster immediately took his station at his feet. But this time, he didn't curl up to sleep. He sat tall, watching his human, tail thumping a steady rhythm against the floor. Recovery was slow. In the mornings, they walked. At first, they only made it to the corner of the block. The soldier leaned on his cane, and Buster walked slowly beside him, matching his pace step for step. He didn't pull on the leash. He didn't chase pigeons. He was guiding his wounded comrade. As the weeks passed, the cane disappeared. The walks got longer. They went to the park, where the trees were exploding with green leaves. The concrete forest, once a maze of gray danger, was now full of color. The soldier started buying coffee from a cart and actually talking to the vendor. He nodded at other dog owners. He was rejoining the world, and Buster was his anchor. One afternoon, they returned to the canal. The ice was gone, replaced by sparkling blue water. The bench was dry. They stood there for a moment, looking at the spot where the soldier had crawled onto the ice. It seemed like a lifetime ago. The soldier reached down and unclipped the leash. "Go on," he said softly. "You're free." Buster looked at the open park, then at the man. He trotted a few steps away, sniffed a patch of clover, and then immediately circled back to sit by the soldier's left leg. He didn't want to be free. He wanted to be here. He looked up, and the soldier looked down. There was no sadness in the man's eyes anymore, only a quiet, steady light. Now they patrol the park together every morning. The grass is green, and the air is warm. The soldier doesn't stare at the water with sadness anymore. He watches Buster chase squirrels, and sometimes he even laughs. The neighbors wave at them, calling out, "Morning, Buster." "Morning, Arthur." The dog looks up at his human, matching his pace perfectly. The concrete forest is no longer a place of survival. It is simply home.